Waning Eikon.
Final Fantasy is my favorite series, ever. Even as someone who's only really invested significant time into it recently, I can say that with 100% confidence. Whether it's the main series itself, its sister franchise in Kingdom Hearts, or something directly inspired by it like Nier, Final Fantasy in its entirety is a franchise that I think defines the term video game. The gameplay these titles present, whether good or bad, are always unique. The worlds are vast and filled to the brim with all sorts of weird and interesting lore to uncover, and the narratives and those present offer experiences that genuinely have changed my perspective on this series, the industry, and to a degree, life itself. It's one of the few pioneer series of RPGs that's still going even to this day, and I don't think enough is said about the longevity of Final Fantasy. I find it very impressive that one of the series that helped break this company into the industry still finds new stories to tell. And it's that thought which brings us to today's video. For as iconic as this series is, lately Final Fantasy has seen its reputation take quite a hit. What were once must-have, day one games just aren't anymore. This is an issue Square's been dealing with for years, and despite their efforts, they still haven't managed to find a solution. It's one of the most slept on dilemmas in gaming because when you look at some of the review scores for games like Final Fantasy VII Remake or Rebirth, you'd think things are all good. Yet I believe it's only now where we've reached the boiling point. Things have gotten so tense, people are now questioning the aspects that make a Final Fantasy a Final Fantasy. Turn-based versus real-time action, high medieval fantasy or a more realistic setting. These are some of the silly debates you'll find all over the web. It's understandable. The question is almost too tantalizing to ignore. And over the last year, I've dived deep into some of the most controversial SquareEnix games of recent memory. They all have a valid case in being regarded as the most Final Fantasy or whatever, but there's one that stands out amongst the pack, one that hasn't left my mind. So to answer the question, what makes a Final Fantasy a Final Fantasy? There was only one game I could turn to. This is it. This is the one. If there was ever a game that truly defines what it means to be Final Fantasy, its 16th installment does so in spades. I've said many bold things about Final Fantasy XVI, that it's arguably the best action game of all time, that it's no doubt a game that stands shoulders and even surpasses those that came before it. Yeah, I got a little excited upon my first playthrough. It has all the hallmarks of a great AAA game, and it hits all the notes of things I'm looking for in a long experience. Simply put, I think Final Fantasy XVI is a journey worth taking for anyone who has any interest in the series. Yet upon its release, I was surprised to see that sentiment not shared amongst my peers. It was almost like Kingdom Hearts 3 in that way. You either loved it or you hated it. Unlike that game, however, this had a much more negative effect in terms of what's important to SquareEnix. The sales of Final Fantasy XVI, while impressive in their own right, did not meet Square's expectations. One could say the company shouldn't set the bar so high as interest in Final Fantasy nears an all-time low, but either way, this doesn't look good. It's weird because, like I said, it has everything you'd expect when you pay that $70 price tag. But because of the simple fact it didn't meet expectations, Final Fantasy XVI has become the poster child for Square's financial failures. It doesn't matter that other projects are at fault for this too. Because 16 was the first one read alongside the unfortunate news, the perception has totally flipped, and only a very specific segment of die-hard fans like myself really saw the masterpiece Yoshi P and the team crafted. Yet it was upon this second playthrough where I was able to learn even new things. some that made me fall in love with this franchise even more, and others that paint an ominous cloud over the sky for this series as a whole. As always, a few disclaimers before we begin. As much as I'd like to say I won't cover the entire tale of the Mother Crystals again, I know myself and will probably do so anyway, so here is your spoiler warning now. Gonna be talking about all the characters and the narrative in depth, so if you don't know what's going on, that's on you. Also, as embarrassing as it is, I gotta clarify one thing. I'm going to say a lot of things, both good and even a little bad. So if any feelings get hurt along the way, know that it's unintentional on my end. I've sort of garnered this negative reputation around the Final Fantasy community where I'm seen as this hater who enjoys finding every little nitpick in every FF game he talks about. And if this is something you believe, then you just never knew me at all. I'm not really doing myself any favors by using my favorite game of all time as the subject to discuss these points, but if you think I hated any of the Final Fantasy games I was negative about, then I'm sorry, but you're wrong. You're wrong because I wouldn't spend 2 literal hours going back and forth on Rebirth trying to decide whether or not I liked it, to a point where even after that endeavor, I still can't fully process my thoughts on it. If that doesn't speak to you in any way, then there's nothing more I can say. Just know that anything I say always comes from a place of love and admiration for Final Fantasy I don't think I'll ever be able to fully comprehend. This series means so much to so many, and when discussing it in video format, one is always towing a very fine line. I understand that, and I hope that'll be reflected in the words you hear. So, one final time, let's dive into Final Fantasy XVI and learn how the Blight not only infected the inhabitants of Valisthea, but the very company who crafted this fantasy to begin with.
A game of dominance.
Oh yeah, now that's media res storytelling done right. We open with a group of bandits caught between a conflict between the Iron Kingdom and the Dhalmekian Empire. This battle ensues because the world of Valisthea has been infected by a phenomenon known as the Blight, an ever-advancing disaster that threatens to render the land uninhabitable. In defiance of such a disaster, the kingdoms across Valisthea wage war against one another for whatever land that still bears fruit. Things have gotten so dire that alliances out of mutual interest must be formed, shown brilliantly by this tense meeting between the Dhalmekians and the Kingdom of Waloed. At the center of these conflicts are the Eikons. Combined with the power of their dominant, these Goliaths of godhood are what tip the scales across every nation and will determine who will survive against the plight of the Blight. Caught in the middle of this are a group of bandits sent by the Empire of Sanbreque to retrieve Shiva's dominance so it can strengthen their brigade against all the other kingdoms. For in the world of Valisthea, only the strong may survive. Meet Clive Rossfield. What we currently know is that he's a bearer, one capable of using the gift of magic. As Clive and his companions make their way over to the battlefield to scope out the situation, they are greeted with the arrival of 2 Eikons, Titan representing Dhalmekia, and Shiva representing the Iron Kingdom. As expected, the battle between these 2 mammoths causes major damage to the surrounding area, separating Clive from his colleagues. As he makes his way to reunite with them, Clive finds himself unable to dodge the oncoming debris, which causes him to lose consciousness. This brings us to the true introduction of Final Fantasy XVI. If you've been around the block before, you'll know that I think the introduction of a video game is arguably its most important part. I say it all the time, but it is the game's audition to hook you in as a player. Its chance to sell you on the journey you'll no doubt be spending a significant amount of time on. The signs of a solid introduction are pretty simple in my eyes. Give me an idea of the place I'm going to be experiencing and why I'm running around in it. When it's time to throw down, give me my one tutorial and let me get on with it. And finally, and this is a bit personal, give me one sick-ass hype moment that has me on the edge of my seat begging for more. Although it's brief, the teenage portion of Clive's journey I think does almost everything I want from the introduction of a modern day video game. Something you have to come to terms with when playing these games is that there is a chance, even if it is slight, that this is someone's first time playing a video game. A lot of games feel the need to hold your hand and explain every little mechanic to you. Sometimes that's helpful, but most times it's like, okay, can I just play the game, please? Oh, don't get it twisted, this intro still is the length of a feature-length film, but I never got that "can we move on" feeling. That can obviously be attributed to the stellar writing and visual set pieces on display for sure, but I think from a simple design standpoint, it hits everything it needs to. Final Fantasy XVI by design is a linear game. You're going to be exploring some of the prettiest hallways in all of gaming, but at the end of the day, that's all they are. Hallways. Yet, I didn't find this limiting. I don't think people give enough credit to the slower moments in these games. The moments where the player can take a second and breathe and really let process what just happened. You'll sit there for a cutscene where major plot points are revealed, and then you'll be thrown right into another cutscene to show you entering another major area. To some, that's really jarring and can kill the immersion the narrative's trying to present, yet I just don't see it like that. Don't get me wrong, I hate being forced to walk around when I can spend that time playing the game itself. And boy, there are plenty of times where the game is just straight up on autopilot. But I'm a man of spectacle, and that is Final Fantasy's bread and butter, baby. Unsurprisingly, 16 packs the heat in that regard, so anytime I wasn't controlling the character, I was in constant awe trying to process what my eyes were watching. So what exactly is going on in the year of the Realm 860? We learn Clive Rosfield is the firstborn son of the Archduke of Rosaria. Yet, although he was born first, he has no claim to the throne due to the fact that he was not the one who inherited the dominant residing in the Rosfield bloodline. That honor was passed on to Clive's younger brother Joshua, and it's a burden that weighs heavily on the young lad's shoulders. Joshua has always had a weak constitution, so he constantly gets these small illnesses that hold him back from reaching his true potential. So Clive decides the best way he can support his younger brother is to become his sworn shield, a guardian that will lay his life down for the Phoenix should the situation ever arise. Joining them is their best friend Jill Warwick. Taken from her native home in the northern territories of Valisthea, Jill was taken at a young age to act as a ward for Rosaria at Archduke Elwin's behest. And of course, who could forget everyone's favorite little frost wolf, Torgal. Aw, look how cute he is! Later on, Elwin informs Clive that the Iron Kingdom plans to advance on Rosarian territory in the form of Phoenix Gate. While he and the main infantry will head to the gate with Joshua, Clive is ordered to depart to Stillwind to deal with some local ruffians causing trouble. Upon succeeding in his mission, Clive rendezvous with the rest of his compatriots at Phoenix Gate to prepare for the upcoming battle set to begin on the morrow. Unfortunately, fate has other things in store. Allies of the Rosarian Kingdom, the Empire of Sambrek, turn coat and murder every Rosarian in search of the Phoenix himself, and I think we know what happens next. The Archduke of Rosaria is beheaded right in front of Joshua, leaving him in a fit of rage so severe it forces him to prime into the Phoenix. In defiance of the Phoenix's appearance, another icon of fire once long thought lost, Ifrit, enters the field to challenge the Phoenix. This battle of deities leads to Ifrit reigning supreme over the Phoenix. In the aftermath of the battle, it's revealed that Lady Annabella betrayed her husband and kingdom to form an alliance with the Empire of Sambrek. For now, we don't quite understand her motives, but interestingly enough, when the moment comes to murder her firstborn son, Annabella spares Clive and decides to enlist him in the Imperial Army due to the boy's skill with a sword. With this, the true tale of the Mother Crystals can begin. I think the introduction in Final Fantasy XVI does an excellent job at getting the player to invest themselves in this story. So much happens in such a short space of time, but the pacing never feels poor. It doesn't waste its time setting the stakes for the emotional journey you're going to embark on. And hindsight 2020 here, but for how little this actually means to the grand scheme of the narrative, I'm beyond impressed that even now, revisiting it for a second time, I find myself at the edge of my seat during almost every little interaction. Something I found myself doing subconsciously was really honing in on the slower, lighter moments where characters are just conversing, and it's with this where I found a new level of satisfaction. Take for instance when Annabella walks in for the first time. She's surrounded by a few of her servants who are quite frankly terrified to even look at her. She approaches the 3 young bucks and she swoons over Joshua, but when Clive extends himself to acknowledge his mother, the look on her face says it all. The sheer disgust she has that Clive even has the audacity to speak to her tells you everything you need to know about Annabella. It's one of those blink and you'll miss it type moments, yet when you really look at it, this short instance showcases the brilliance of the type of storytelling Final Fantasy XVI is using. This is meant to be an epic. It's meant to have you feel and express so many different emotions over the course of its runtime. Another great example is when the troops of Rosaria are celebrating after Clive's success in Stillwind. I find this short conversation between Joshua and Elwyn very interesting when discussing the Phoenix as a character. Joshua looks over to his father and simply asks him why this icon of fire is always born into the Rossfield family, because to him it doesn't really seem fair that they be treated as royalty for something that really came down to pure luck. I really like how there's no real answer to this either. Elwyn's response really comes off like, yeah bro, I don't know either. Let's just make the most of it, I guess. Lamau! Yet it didn't leave me wanting. How can one explain such a phenomenon, let alone in the introduction of the game? It elegantly asks the question of why things are the way they are without spoiling everything the narrative has to offer. This transitions seamlessly to Joshua's conversation with Clive. Following his father's answer, Joshua comes to terms with his feelings and believes he shouldn't have been the one that inherited the Phoenix. He truly believes his older brother should have been the one who was blessed. Clive, in response, assures his brother that he views his duty as his shield as a noble one, and that him being passed over by the Phoenix means nothing, for he has his brother, and for him, that is enough. It's just insane to me how much you can glean from these characters in these short interactions. Joshua is a young lad with a heavy conscience. For one to be so young yet still question the very fabrics of how the world works in an attempt to understand your destiny is wild even now for me to type out. Let alone the fact that he constantly has a cold. To have the weight of an entire nation on your shoulders at such a tender age and be totally aware of this is a testament to the type of person Joshua is. And this extends to his older brother as well. In this early portion of the narrative, you can tell Clive is someone who doesn't take things for granted. He seems very content to even be involved to such a degree. Even when his mother scolds him for just existing, he never overlooks the love he gets from everyone else. It helps that this sentiment Annabella has isn't shared amongst the citizens of Rosaria. Clive is often looked at one with authority and he is very much respected by his peers. But in his own words, it wasn't until he could prove his skills with the blade where people really took notice of him. It doesn't take much to learn that Clive has a chip on his shoulder, and while he doesn't let that get in the way of what's really important to him, you can tell the perception of him amongst his friends and family is something that clearly bothers him. But most importantly, it's his dedication to his role as his sworn shield that really defines Clive. When shit hits the fan, Clive is more worried over Joshua's safety than anyone else, and watching him transform into the Phoenix legitimately breaks him. Things finally started looking up for Clive. He successfully took down a Morble in his first official assignment. He went toe-to-toe with one of the legendary Dragoons. Yet as he desperately watches Ifrit go to town on the Phoenix, the harsh reality sets in that despite his best efforts, he just can't save the one he swore to protect, and the line delivery here sent a chill down my spine I have never, ever felt.
Joshua! Stop it! Stop it! I swore I would protect him! Please! Please! Stop it! I'll kill you! I'll fucking kill you!
I say all this because this form of storytelling does a very good job humanizing the characters. In a series titled Final Fucking Fantasy, it's unsurprising that these games lean heavily into the showcase of it all. Taking the time to really give us a glance at these characters as human beings inherently draws the player in to see what more there is to be explored with these people. I attribute a lot of this to the game's writing style. It all ties back to Square's fabulous Nova initiative they debuted with Final Fantasy XIII. The idea there, primarily with a certain side project, was to create a fantasy based on reality, a world where the fantasy elements would creep into our world. It's quite interesting then that Final Fantasy XVI's main director, Hiroshi Takai, had this to say in an interview with Gamer Braves in 2023.
We wanted to give the game that kind of dark fantasy feel like you see in Game of Thrones, so there's definitely inspiration there, again because we wanted it to feel more like an adult type of fantasy, more based on reality.
I find this so fascinating because when you hear it said out loud and look at the product we have here in Final Fantasy XVI, it's like having your own personal brain blast moment. Epics such as Game of Thrones predicate themselves on having interesting characters that build the world alongside the narrative. To make it easier to understand, I'll say it like this. Similar to how you can't picture Final Fantasy VII without characters like Cloud Strife or Sephiroth, the same could be said about A Song of Ice and Fire. You can't picture anyone else in these roles than the characters present. It couldn't be anyone else but Jon Snow who led the Battle of the Bastards. It couldn't be anyone else but Daenerys who became the Breaker of Chains. Just little shit like that. More often than not, these stories need extensive time to build before the really crazy, "Holy shit, did you see that?" moments happen. For example, Game of Thrones literally opens with our introduction to the White Walkers, one of the many threats to the world of Westeros. Fast forward 6 seasons and over 10 literal years, and the White Walkers finally, maybe, perhaps, become relevant once again. In this instance, it didn't quite land the way the creators intended, but I think you get my point. I think it was important for me to dedicate enough time to analyze this because SquareEnix games, at least the high budget ones, are really long in the tooth these days. If you're anything like me and try to do everything there is to do, you'll be spending multiple work weeks worth of time getting through these adventures. If the game can't hook you in during those initial hours, it's almost a lost cause to take this much inspiration from something only for it to not land. Luckily for us, Final Fantasy XVI sets the bar very high right out of the gate. You want deep gameplay? Oh, it has that in spades. Take a look at the Dragoon boss fight. I think this is one of the best examples of how to really introduce your player into how complex the game can get. It teaches you everything you'll need to know about the pinnacle of combat. It teaches you that QuickTime events, while present and can bother some, will present some of the best visuals you'll ever see. Is that not enough for you? Don't feel like there's enough spectacle? Want this to feel like a theme park attraction? Oh, don't you worry, my boy, because the Phoenix and Ifrit Eikon fight has you covered. Yeah, it is essentially the most on-rail Star Fox space battle mixed with QuickTime events, but I can't help but be taken aback by it all. There's so much crazy shit going on all at one time, my mind is still playing catch-up. There are some issues that will tie into some things I want to address later, but it's as airtight as it can be. Certainly the best since what? Final Fantasy XIII? Wow, that's something I never thought I'd say out loud. Huh, go figure. When I look at this in tandem with the thought process of what makes a Final Fantasy just that, I look back at a lot of the moments that happen here and I can't help but feel this evokes the series name almost better than any other. The fight between Ifrit and the Phoenix would be a final boss in almost any other game. But here, this is how we get things started. If that isn't Final Fantasy, then I don't know what is.
Here be icons.
Once we flashed forward back to the year 873, we meet Sidolphus Telamon, or rather Sid for short. Still don't think this is Final Fantasy enough for ya? Sid is the leader of a band of freedom fighters, and ultimately he wants Clive to join his cause, as it is Sid who seems to be the only one tackling the issue of the Blight head on. Once Clive returns with Sid back to the hideaway, he reveals exactly what it is he wants to do. Sid's goal ultimately is to destroy the many mother crystals spread across Valisthea, for he believes it is the overuse of Great Greeker's gift that has caused the Blight to infect the world so. This gift I refer to is of course the magic the bearers wield. Bearers are enslaved all across the land. While some kingdoms like Rosaria do their part and treat bearers with a bit more dignity, most see them as worse than insects. You go around and hear enough women proudly proclaim how they got rid of their infant child all because they were blessed with the ability to shoot fire out of their fingers or something. It sounds so petty and almost jealous in a way. These people are oppressed for no other reason than the fact that they're different. This is something that bothers Sid, so he hypothesizes that if we destroy the very thing giving us the gift, magic would cease to exist and everyone would be the same. There's flaws in Sid's ideals for sure. Why should the bearers be the one to give up the very thing that makes them stand out? Once the situation becomes clearer, his reason for these actions makes a whole lot of sense. While the ability to use magic is a gift, no doubt, it comes at the cost of the bearer's physical form. Use your powers enough times and your body will form into a gray husk as the life is drained out of the user. If it means sacrificing the bombastic power magic gives its user, Sid is more than happy to make that trade so the inhabitants of Valisthea can all live as happy and peaceful lives as possible. I like this because it highlights just how intelligent Sid is. He's labeled as an outlaw, a title that can rival the term bearer as the lowest of the low. One might assume Sid would just be another ruffian, but leave it to Final Fantasy to handle the one character that's consistent across these games. This plan alone shows how cunning he is. He thinks over every meticulous detail. Because out loud, destroying the very thing that gives the world life sounds pretty fucking dumb if you ask me. But when you actually hear why you'll be doing that, the plan sort of makes sense. I mean, let's be real. Bro is asking a random stranger to go on a borderline suicide mission. Clive not wanting to do this to focus on his own shit makes a lot of sense. After going on a few adventures with Sid, however, Clive begins to open up to the idea of joining the rebels' cause. This dynamic works because these guys have periods where they feel each other out. They aren't totally convinced of one another in the beginning, so when Clive does decide to join the cause, it feels genuine and earned. And once Clive and Sid decide to collaborate, the game finally opens up, where I can now talk about how exactly you'll be engaging with Final Fantasy XVI. The simplest way I can put it is that this game is broken down into 3 major parts. We of course have the narrative, which kinda speaks for itself, the world and how you explore, and of course, my favorite, the combat. To change the pace a little, let's talk about the actual game for a bit here. Going back to what I said earlier, Final Fantasy XVI is a very linear game. I'd go so far as to say it's a defining title in that aspect. The world is divided into a bunch of major open areas, yes, and there is a bit of freedom, but in reality, they're just hallways stitched together to create a small environment for you to explore. And to be frank, there's not much going on. There's plenty of monsters to test your skills on, but in terms of treasures or other things to do, this isn't that kind of game. It's weird because you take the little bridge on Orabelle down and you can't help but be captivated as you expose yourself to the Blight's innate beauty. You gotta remember, this is Final Fantasy. The way I understand it, this is supposed to be the final stand for whichever world we're in. Not to sound too cliche, but it's supposed to be the world's Final Fantasy. The swan song before it resets into something unfamiliar. You play a game like Rebirth, for example, and those elements are there, but it's almost too peaceful. And when you're warping into dimensions that look like this for the side content, the tone doesn't exactly evoke the Final Fantasy feeling I get when reading that title. Don't get me wrong, these things are all staples of the franchise and in some way should be referenced, but I find it very jarring how in one instance we'll be hanging out on the beach like it's nothing, then in that same instance fight this giant robotic squid thing. Now look at Final Fantasy XV. EOS follows a similar format and even goes so far as to straight up mimic the modern day Midwest of the time. It has its moments where things feel almost apocalyptic in a sense, but for a majority of it, the consensus with this one is that it's a road trip with the boys. I have literally heard people boil down the entirety of 15 like this before, and that is just fucking bonkers to me. Final Fantasy XVI immediately understands the weight of expectation that comes with the title. The world at times is naturally beautiful where the skies are shining, yet it never removes that feeling of decay. You come up to a town and see how down everyone is not because of the blight itself, but because of what it's done to society. Resources are scarce, and there's a caste system in place that unjustifiably divides people rather than bringing them together. Things are just miserable. Everyone is shit out of their luck. When I look at Valisthea in its entirety, it's this combination that really enhances the feeling we're at World's End. As someone who is trying to immerse myself in the game, I was legitimately uncomfortable walking around at times. Yet, I found myself awed by the beauty of it all. Through the blight and all the melancholic shit spread across the land, there's almost a calmness that makes its way through each and every step you take. You'll be in the Deadlands, no magic made available to you. The situation alone is scary enough. Yet, I wasn't tense. I wasn't afraid. I was too busy enjoying the scenery on display. As one cohesive world, nothing really comes close to Valisthea in my eyes. I go to Sambrek, for example, and in many ways, it looks and feels very similar to Rosaria. Yet, there's just enough that's unique that makes it feel distinct to any other place. Take a trip over to Dhalmekia and you'll get the most different location in the game. Yeah, it is just a typical desert area, but I still don't feel like it separates itself from all the grassy places in the game. You start to notice a pattern. Similar to the intro, there's a very specific emotion the world is trying to capture. For how important the iconography of Final Fantasy is, Valisthea is a place I feel the most intrigued exploring. Eventually, the effects of the blight became one of the many visual details I came to admire. The sheer scale of Valisthea itself is almost a marvel on its own. Sure, it's not exactly Rebirth levels of room to breathe, but you look out and see all the mountains and buildings and shit like that, and you can't help but feel captivated. Like I said, I'm a man of spectacle, and the amount of individual places I can remember off the top of my head is ridiculous. The bridge on Orabel Downs, like I mentioned. Both versions of the hideaway. The salty ruins right outside the shopping district in Dalamil. The snaky path on the way to the palace in Waloed. And an almost Niagara Falls-esque set piece right outside Balklad. Dude, I could go on all day. Let me ask you something. How many of you really take the time to just sink it all in? Find a nice spot to just stand there and take in the beautiful sight that's sitting right in front of you? I'd wager not many. I don't fault you there. For as exciting as Final Fantasy XVI gets, taking the time to slow down really isn't high on the priority list. But you're really missing out on some of the most visually stimulating set pieces ever conceived in a video game. I lost count how many times I'd stop and just absorb the environment around me. I was conscious of every aspect of the world, the visuals, the thematic reason for being here, and even the inspiration behind it. Most of the realm resembles the United Kingdom. Waloed, for example, I believe is meant to represent Wales, and the real-life beef the Welsh have with England is nearly directly tied into Waloed's conquest. And as someone who's familiar with the Middle East, you can't tell me that Dhalmekia is not meant to mimic the deserts of Wadi Rum, just with that Final Fantasy spice to it. This is all a really long way of saying Valisthea as a location is one of the finest worlds in Final Fantasy in just about every aspect. It's gorgeous at a technical level. It interweaves its way into the story brilliantly, and frankly, it just feels good to be in. But I mean, if you're not exactly doing anything interesting, the world can only carry you so far. Which means, yeah, it's finally time for me to start cooking. Look, I'm just gonna keep it a $150 with you guys. The way you battle anything, literally anything in Final Fantasy XVI is like the coolest thing I've ever personally experienced. When I say the combat mechanics in Final Fantasy XVI are straight up goated, I want you to hear that shit. When it comes to what I'm looking for in a Final Fantasy, my go-to first and foremost will always be the combat. That may be silly to say seeing as how the original creator looks for other things, but the way you mow down enemies is how you ultimately prove you're the world's savior. Historically, Final Fantasy has always taken things popular in the industry at the time and added their own twist to make it wholly original. This philosophy has created some of the most innovative mechanics in gaming. The ATB system is the most well-known and has gone on to define combat in Final Fantasy for generations. In the last decade or so, Square has been chasing this dream of creating the perfect blend of Final Fantasy and real-time action combat. These attempts have been met with, mixed reception, let's say. Between Final Fantasy XV forcing you to hold down a button to attack normally, and the remake trilogy pausing the game at any given point, to say I believe they've reached their intended goal would be a lie. I'd straight up be lying. But you know what they say, if at first you don't succeed, try and try again. At its core, Final Fantasy XVI is the most real-time action game SquareEnix has ever created or published. Real-time action is a genre that's often misunderstood. Many see these games as nothing more than button mashers that can be broken down to terms as simple as mindless, and if you're in this camp, do you, I guess. But I find this to be a very simple way of thinking. Because on the surface, yeah, you're not wrong. There is a lot of button mashing, but it's the way you think about pressing those buttons where it goes from just a video game to something you obsess over constantly. Final Fantasy XVI mechanically has all the trademarks of your typical action game. Of course, you have your standard means of attack in the form of Clive's multi-hit combo, and you also have your cool style and special skills with the icons and the magic Clive wields. At its most basic, you can say it's like everything else. But that's the brilliance of the genre. It asks you, the player, to learn these simple mechanics and refine them to a point where you're pulling off some of the craziest shit you've ever seen. As it attempts to meld hardcore action and the insane spectacle only a Final Fantasy can provide, what you get is a combat system I find to be truly next level. I already loved it the first time around, but when I look back, I really was enjoying it at a surface level. The flashy animations and colors were enough to satisfy me at the time. As fun as it was, I don't think I made the most of the tools made available to me. I guess that's the brilliance of New Game Plus then, as it was here where I found a new level of depth to Clive's moveset. You might have missed the little words Final Fantasy on top of the HUD here. You're probably wondering what that means. My dear viewers, it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to
Final Fantasy Mode.
This difficulty is exclusive to New Game Plus and is the hardest challenge you can seek in a playthrough of Final Fantasy XVI. You retain all your abilities from your previous adventure as well as the majority of armor and gear you accumulated, but Valisthea is even more dangerous in Final Fantasy mode. Dungeon and hunt board bosses are implemented into the overworld upon defeating them for the first time. Every enemy's level has risen to either match or surpass your own, and these monstrosities are even more aggressive during encounters. Simply put, Final Fantasy mode is 16's hard mode. Upon reflection, the action-focused difficulty was never really anything I couldn't handle. I did get bodied a handful of times, but I wasn't exactly sweating during most normal encounters. Final Fantasy mode does not play by these same rules. Spamming dodge and using the standard 3-hit combo with a little magic blast at the end will only get you so far in these ends. I had a very specific image in mind when deciding the style of play I wanted to capture, and in a way, I wanted to keep it thematic to some previous discussions on this channel. So with that spirit in mind, I made quite a bold decision. Do you remember those super sick ultimate moves that are almost a set piece in and of themselves? I didn't use those. Not only because they are the longest moves to recharge, but because they ultimately hindered the style I wanted to play. The way I describe the way I play action games is twitchy. That sounds so dumb to say, but I'm always doing something to keep the flow going. So I decided to stick with skills that complemented this idea. This brings me to aerial combat, something I totally neglected the last time I talked about this game. If you've watched any of my videos on Final Fantasy in the past, you'll know that the Sky and myself typically don't get along. What starts off as a thrilling mechanic, more often than not boils down to just sitting in the air and wailing on the enemy until it dies. You look at Kingdom Hearts 3 and come to realize all the options flooding your screen are essentially meaningless because Sora will just float there endlessly as long as I'm hitting attack on the menu. 5 years later, an aerial combat is introduced in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. While refined to a degree, the same philosophy applies. Mash that X button and you'll stay airborne as long as you have something to target. If this is something you're into, that's sick, dude. The animations are quite exciting after all, but personally, I think it's boring as shit. It actively makes you avoid every other system available to you, because in essence you can ask, well, if this is working, why should I change things up? Thank freaking God Final Fantasy XVI doesn't play by those rules. The stuff you're doing in the air is very reminiscent of classic PS2 styled action combat. Clive won't just stay in the air as long as you're hitting the attack button. At some point he needs to hit the ground before he can get back in the air. This is the key change that opens up the entire system. Making Clive reset his aerial combos gives the enemy more agency in combat. Even if it's just a split second, letting the enemy have that moment asks the player to quickly yet correctly decide which skill will keep the combo going. Because it is considered a limited action that can only be activated by stomping on the opponent, you have little to no time to decide what your next action is once you get in the air. And it's that type of frantic interaction that I love to engage with. That's not even getting into the fact that you can straight up carry your opponents with the right setup. The stomp mechanic is probably Final Fantasy XVI's unsung hero. On the surface, it seems like something you do just to get yourself airborne. But then you start to mash buttons and you notice, oh shit, something just happened. This action I'm referring to is how stomping on enemies when they're in the air resets their position, allowing you to reset your moves. So if I finish a combo in the air, I have the meaningful choice to either continue wailing on the enemy, or I can bring them down with a big boom magic attack. Because I actually have to input these commands rather than the game doing it for me, it feels that much better when you pull it off. It's not like I have an idea of what I want to do when I'm in the air. It's all reactionary. They say the best type of inspiration is the one that comes without any notice. And that's kinda how this aspect of combat feels. I always feel like I'm trying something new. Patterns might form in brief periods, but more often than not, I'm mashing the attack button differently. It reminds me so much of Kingdom Hearts 2. Like Sora, Clive feels like a paintbrush, and every encounter, regardless of scale, feels like a canvas for you to express yourself in any way you see fit. Something I just love doing is literally stomping on an enemy midair just to let them hang there for a second. Ugh, it's like the most addicting shit ever. It's one of those things you can do to flex to all your friends that you have a mastery over these mechanics they could never hope to attain. It's wildly satisfying to lift an enemy up and almost use them like an accordion ladder to get higher in the sky, all like, whoa, whoa, till eventually you reach the peak and BAM! Bring them to their demise. Just so fucking good, bruv. Whenever I see someone else repeatedly stomp on their enemy, that's how I know they know what's up. The way this all ties into the skills you can equip is quite frankly brilliant. Dude, there are so many different skills to choose from. It's overwhelming in all the best ways because it allows you to choose exactly how you want to play. Want to go for a slower, more methodical style where damage output is your focus? You can do that. Want to focus on the spectacle of it all? There's a way to do that. Or do you want to play like a spider monkey zipping around at breakneck speeds, giving your opponent no chance to breathe? Oh buddy, is this the one for you? Because I wanted to really explore the aerial combat this time around, I opted for skills that complemented this idea. So for example, Garuda Spinning Slash not only deals a ridiculous amount of damage when you've maxed it out, but it also propels both Clive and the enemy he's making contact with into the air. From there, I can get my aerial combo going to quickly delete my foe from existence. Or take a look at something like Shiva's Mesmerize. All it really does is bring enemies closer to you. But if you're in the air and combine this with Garuda's Spinning Slash, its use has much more utility. It's this level of thinking that makes every encounter so enjoyable for me. I could have the same setup for the entire runtime of the game, yet no battle would feel the same as another. It'll feel familiar, but there's always room for even more creativity. Take for example Ramuh's Lightning Rod. This skill puts a little spark on the battlefield. Slash it and it'll deal AoE damage. It's very simple, yet one of its properties makes it an absolute game changer. It doesn't matter what type of attack hits the spark. As long as something is making contact with it, the effect will occur. This completely changes how you think of using the lightning rod. Combined with the fact you can move the spark at any moment before it disappears, and it becomes arguably the most important tool in your arsenal. You don't get any physical feedback, but anytime those sparks pop up, you feel like you're breaking the game. And not in the boring, godified, everything's easy kind of way. It's like a cheat code that makes the combat feel all that much sweeter. What makes it that much better too is the fact that these are just a few of the ways you can use these skills. When you're offered a moveset as wide as Final Fantasy XVI's, the idea of having multiple playstyles isn't something that should surprise you. I sort of had an epiphany as I engaged with Valistia's monsters this time around. I got into a really long discussion with my roommate recently about how we play action games. On one hand, I know exactly what I want to experience. I typically don't experiment too much, and I know exactly the type of style I want to play. My roommate, on the other hand, loves to experiment. He'll be playing one way for 40 hours of the game, and then hour 41 rolls around, a variety of new skills unlocked, and he'll switch everything up just to see what's possible. I never stopped thinking about this when I was playing Final Fantasy XVI. Was I limiting myself? Was my roommate just being extra? It was this thought process that helped me realize there's no wrong way to play these games. You should do what's fun for you. And almost subconsciously, I was experimenting more than I frequently would. I had the core moves I would never change, yeah, but I was using skills I had never even tried before in favor of skills I was more comfortable using. Like, I didn't even use Bahamut. Probably my favorite icon my first go around, at all during this playthrough. I wanted something different, and Final Fantasy XVI doesn't make me shy away from that. I was able to marry the two philosophies to where I really think I found what I consider peak action combat. I could complain about the cooldown timers, but why would I when my playstyle works around it? I can complain about the sudden halt when I mess up an input, but why would I when it lasts less than the pause when anyone talks in Kingdom Hearts 3? If you know, you fucking know. I just can't really find any nitpicks with this one because there's always a but there that always fixes whatever issue I may have. It has nothing that annoys me like being able to stay in the air by inputting the simplest of inputs. There is almost no waiting in between commands, and there's even hidden mechanics you might not realize you can mess with that can change your perception of the genre. Now this is something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. Dodge offset. It is the most overlooked mechanic in the existence of this genre. I'd go so far to say that many of you watching have no idea what this even is. Dodge offset, the way I understand it, is a way to cancel an action before the animation fully completes. Essentially, it's a get out of jail free card you can rely on if your hands are fast enough. Since Final Fantasy XVI functions off the stagger system, for a majority of an encounter the enemy will also be attacking you. Even through your big, strong attacks, having a tool like Dodge Offset tucked away in your back pocket is essential. I understand it's hard to process what I'm saying because Dodge Offset by nature is a very niche mechanic, so let me paint you a little picture. Let's say you're using Titan's JoJo Punch here. It's a skill that once started won't end until the animation plays out. Although it is powerful, it leaves you vulnerable to your enemies, and on Final Fantasy mode, they will take those chances if you leave yourself open. With Dodge Offset though, I have the nuanced control to get myself out of the way should I sense danger, and if I'm successful, I can keep the flow going. It sounds unfair in a way, but it works because it's something you need to be conscious of. It's the combination of all these things and other mechanics like Torgal as your only other controllable party member that truly define Final Fantasy XVI. And when it comes to answering this video's central question, I can say with certainty that this is absolutely Final Fantasy. Character customization is one of the staples of this series, and with the sheer amount of ways you can mow down your foes, I'd say Clive has us pretty much covered in that regard. And if you look at the gameplay itself, yeah, it is an action game, but in essence, what really separates this from something like, say, the original Final Fantasy VII? In that game, you equip your characters with weapons and materia that allow each character to use unique abilities. Aerith is considered the healer of the party until her untimely demise, but if you wanted, you could make her your main damage dealer. Cloud could be your healer. Barrett could be the one who handles all the buffing and debuffing. My point is, the characters played the roles you wanted them to. All that was stopping you was your own imagination. Now look at Final Fantasy XVI. You equip weapons and gear that allows your character to use unique abilities. You can explore what type of playstyle you want to play. Slow and methodical is one way to go about it and certainly has its advantages. Or you could focus on quick reaction-based inputs. Maybe you want to think a few steps ahead and line things up before unleashing all your skills. That sounds kind of familiar. Oh yeah, because it's exactly like the Final Fantasy VII I just described. But one's turn-based, and that's a real Final Fantasy. Whatever, guy. For those actually listening, you see what I'm saying, right? Like, I'm not crazy here. The similarities are almost uncanny in a way. At its core, you're still doing things you would in other Final Fantasy games, except instead of combat going in the order of turns, it's just real time. Instead of interacting with a menu to deal damage, you just hit a single button. The context is just different now. If you think about it with this mindset, I'd argue the combat we have here is the most Final Fantasy. Finally, after almost 2 decades, Square has finally achieved the action combat they've been longing for. I legitimately have only one complaint, and it's so fucking nitpicky that I don't even think it takes away from the overall experience. Yet, it's something I cannot go without mentioning. Something you need to keep in mind is all these thoughts I'm expressing are tied to the fact that I was playing on Final Fantasy mode, which is exclusive to New Game Plus. It might not sound like a huge difference, but as someone who's dumped over 140 hours into the PS5 version alone, take it from me, it matters. This isn't to say the action-focused difficulty isn't challenging, but where in that mode only a few specific enemies could eliminate you in a few hits, every battle is like that in Final Fantasy mode. It's do or die every time 16 bells or no risk, no reward kicks in. Having that thought in the back of your mind anytime the arena encloses itself around you is invigorating in all the best ways. Having the freedom to experiment with your play is one thing, but being forced to for the sake of surviving is genuinely a next level feeling. But all of this is tied to Final Fantasy XVI's hard mode, which you can only get if you play this game on New Game Plus, which means you have to play the entire story at least once. Even if you skip all the side quests and do just the story, you're still looking at a near 40-hour narrative here. I could praise it to high heaven all day, but if you're not willing to go through the journey once, I don't think you'll be able to really absorb everything I'm trying to say. However, again, this is just a nitpick, because really, Final Fantasy XVI is just the coolest looking game ever when it's in motion. You could be playing on piss baby easy mode and I'd still think you could get something out of this combat system. Without a doubt, these are some of the cleanest animations I've ever seen. I don't even know how it's really possible. Clive transitions so seamlessly from attack to attack, yet it's of the highest standard possible. Combine that with all the crazy particle effects that flood the screen, and the gorgeous scenery surrounding you, and what you get is arguably the most visually stimulating action game ever put together. You could put any instance of this game in motion and you'll be captivated in some form. If not, I genuinely don't think you have a human bone in your body. Because if this isn't the sickest shit you've ever seen, then I don't know why we're even trying anymore. When I decide to look at a game in any sort of retrospective fashion, I never go into it expecting the gameplay to be quote unquote perfect. It has its flaws, yes, just like every other game, but it's how it embraces those flaws that allows Final Fantasy XVI to forge its own identity. It wants to be a crazy hype action game, and that's exactly what it is. It's so unapologetically itself. I talked about this recently, but my barometer for if an action game is good or not is when I can enter a certain mental state, one athletes commonly refer to as the zone. When your movements are so in sync, you're not even thinking about what you're doing. It's just happening organically. Final Fantasy XVI embraces this mindset and not only encourages, but almost forces you to enter the zone to have a chance of surviving some of these encounters. I can't even really describe what it is, but whatever this feeling is, I like it. If I could sum it up in a phrase, I would say Final Fantasy XVI is an all-timer. And for everything I've listed above, and for what I'll no doubt list later, I think you can finally see why. Look. After spending the year focused on games I obviously didn't enjoy, it was nice to just let loose and really dive into a game's systems to see what makes it tick. It's part of the fun of this entire process. It's just so sick, man. Like I went up against Svarog, one of the hardest super bosses in the game, at over a 20 level disadvantage, and I was able to beat it on my first attempt in like 3 minutes. This guy kicked my ass numerous times during my first playthrough, but now I've become the vessel Ultima has been seeking for so long. I don't know, man. This shit's pretty fucking based if you ask me. It's hilarious to me that people will look at a game like Rebirth and jerk that game's combat off to no end, when 16's combat in almost every way really is just better. Yeah, you can keep your foe Kingdom Hearts over there in Midgar. In Valisthea, it's Devil May Fantasy or bust. And to all the haters that say this type of combat doesn't belong in Final Fantasy, that's cool. You don't need to listen to me, but someone you will probably listen to is Hiroshi Takai. In an interview with Inverse before its release, Takai was asked to define what type of game Final Fantasy XVI is. In response, he had this to say.
This will be a game where when people ask, what genre is this, you can't pin it down. We cover so many. What's the genre of the game? It's Final Fantasy.
Need I go on? I think not. Yet, this is only one facet of what makes Final Fantasy XVI the most Final Fantasy. It needs to have its world and combat on lock for sure, but the most delicate matter when dealing with this franchise is no doubt the narrative. So, does the tale of the Mother Crystal stand out among some of the most legendary stories in gaming? Let's find out.
Of gods and men.
As a wise man once said, the tale of the Mother Crystals is one rooted in power, what it is, how to obtain it, and the consequences that it brings. It's a world littered with those who would turn in their own mother to gain the upper hand. At the center of all this chaos is Clive Rossfield. He watched his brother die right in front of him. He reunited with his childhood friend, and he's agreed to a cause that is suicidal in nature. Combine that with the blight infecting society and the kingdom slaughtering each other, and one could get lost with everything going on. If the introduction and the combat was all Season 1, then we'll call this section Season 2. In this season, Clive and Jill adjust to their new lives as outlaws by assisting Sid in his mission for equality. But before they can all embark on this journey, Clive needs to reassure himself of one thing. Since Joshua's passing, Clive has been seeing this strange hooded figure. He believes this stranger to be the one responsible for his brother's demise, and it just so happens that Sid might have an inkling as to where this mystery man might be. It's on the way to Caer Norvent where you really get the feel of the decay Valisthea emanates. It does kind of drag out this mission a bit, but these smaller, lighter moments of levity really enhance the stakes of the journey. Taking the time to learn everyone's names and get a feel for how they go about their daily lives was an odd feeling. I almost felt bad for them in a way. All these poor people, most of them bears who have been treated so harshly they don't even know how to properly communicate with people, being held together by one man's good faith and wit in the market. Clive is mostly an observer, really taking in the reality of the plight Valisthea is currently enduring. It's these little moments that are often overlooked, yet they enhance every reason for going on the journey. Once the game lets loose, you get a few side quests that really let the reality of the situation set in. I mentioned the bears, and I think now's a good time to really dive into this power struggle, we'll call it. As the name entails, bears are those blessed with the Mother Crystal's gift and have the ability to use magic. They are enslaved, and very frequently you're reminded how little society views those who can use magic. Whether it's a portly father and his son using bears as chew toys, or a little girl treating her bear like a pet, it's very clear the people who, in reality, are wizards are the ones who are oppressed. These optional adventures really enhance the narrative's focus on power, because power in this instance isn't about your physical abilities. It goes back to the caste system I mentioned earlier. It's all about bloodlines, legacy, not what you're capable of. You get to see what it's like to have power and what it's like when you don't have it. It sets the tone very nicely, because at this point, Clive is just focused on finding the person responsible for his brother's death. The small moments act like breadcrumbs as it subtly shows Clive the path to his eventual journey. The need for power can be showcased brilliantly by this season's main villain, Benedicta Harmon. Oh my god!
A rousing speech, Lord Commander. I was a fool to believe you might have changed.
Wait.
It is true my liege values loyalty above all else. But were you not quick to betray your countrymen for the promise of coin?
Wait.
Okay. I'm good now. Where was I again? I classified this story as one about power because it's something all the major players struggle with. Benedicta, for example, is someone who can't live without power. Her role as the advisor to King Barnabas is something she mixes up with her worth. Because she's second in command, she believes she's more valuable than anyone who's beneath her. In some instances, I can see why she has this mindset. You can only count on your hands how many people in this series are willing to do the shit that Benedicta does to maintain any sense of worth. She'll slaughter innocent people. She'll whore herself out to maintain friendly relations with another nation. She's motivated and driven, yet blindly so. When Sid and Clive finally meet her at Caer Norvent, you can see how this type of mindset weighs on her. All Sid does is point out that the cause she's fighting for is a lost one. We hint at a previous relationship between the two, so it's natural for Sid to extend a helping hand. That's just the kind of guy he is. But that's the issue of obsessing with power. Accepting help from any outside force isn't something these people tend to do, and she reacts just about the way you'd expect.
The only person I feel sorry for is you! I can't do this anymore. If you would stand between our liege and his dream, then you leave me no choice. Goodbye, Sidolphus.
I want to take a moment and just really hone in on the spectacle here. One of the first things I said in my first Final Fantasy video ever was how Square has been focused on making games that focus on the cinematic aspect games can show off. I refer to it as the movie-like experience, because it imitates a lot of the aspects that movies have. Long establishing shots, moments to take a breath and enjoy the characters rather than the world, stuff like that. Final Fantasy XVI has a lot of these tropes, but it's here where I think the movie-like experience Square has been aiming to capture finally comes full circle. It's not just cinematic, it's fucking cinema itself. Not only is the fight absolutely insane from a gameplay sense, acting as the first real skill check of the game, but as an art piece in a video game, it's first class. It all comes together to tell an epic, compelling story of its own. Clive's desire to learn the truth, and Benedicta's to maintain any sliver of power. A lot of it is presented in the form of QuickTime events. I get it. These kinds of things kinda kill the pace in a gameplay sense, but it's part of the movie, and when you finally process the absurd stuff on screen with Clive lining up in the coolest ways imaginable, you almost don't even care that it's a QTE. Your emotions are meant to be all over the place, and this roller coaster mentality can be applied to the game's first tailor-made attraction, which means yeah, it's time to talk about the Eikon fights. These are the main draw of Final Fantasy XVI, if you will. In terms of combat potential, you're not getting much out of these. Don't get me wrong, there is an optimal way to play, but these challenges are far often easier than playing a standard Clive. I don't see that as an issue, however, because these are where the game truly reaches the peak of cinematic storytelling. Clive has out of nowhere primed into Ifrit. This first battle and the moves available to you reflect that. You won't be doing some of the absurd shit you will later as Clive adjusts to his new form. That's not a dig, mind you, because what I find so interesting is how it takes all these ideas to craft something that surpasses the source material it's inspired from. I look at some of these crazy sequences and I can't help but be mesmerized by the dynamism of the choreography. Yeah, it is essentially Final Fantasy's interpretation of Attack on Titans, but these battles feel almost shonen-esque. These gargantuan beings are able to fly around like Goku and Vegeta as they exchange punches. So again, will these fights provide the most meaningful depth the combat has to offer? No, of course not. But it will captivate you in a way other games just aren't able to. That has to count for something, right? Once the battle has concluded, we finally get a chance to make sense of what the fuck is going on. Benedicta, in her rage, used the last of Garuda's power, which comes at the cost of her own life. She is now finally able to rest after the years of torment she put herself through. The biggest question left to answer is why and how Clive primed into Ifrit. For as we know, there is only one dominant per element. Clive awakens to himself chained up, and during this time, the reality starts to set in for the brooding young adult. Clive thinks the only way he can atone is by paying with his own life. It doesn't take long for Jill to finally regain consciousness. I find the timing of this scene here so interesting. Jill hasn't really been involved, and we as the viewer are still reeling from the reveal that she wields the summon Shiva. Clive, on the other hand, has to come to terms with the fact that the man he's been chasing for 13 long years was himself all along. Both of their mental states are in such a fragile place that saving the world seems like the least of their concerns. It's fitting then that Final Fantasy XVI allows these two to find the closure they need so they can devote themselves to the greater cause calling to them. In this case, having the firstborn son and ward of Rosaria return back to their homeland for the first time since the incident at Phoenix Gate. Similar to your path to Caer Norvent, you'll take some time to see some of the other towns completing some simple tasks for the citizens. What I prefer here is how the focus has now completely shifted from showing Clive the world to his relationship with Jill. This is the first time they're really talking to each other in 13 years. Not so long ago, they were enemies. You can really feel the awkwardness between the two. Clive is still laser focused on the fact that he wields the power of Ifrit. Jill, on the other hand, almost doesn't know what to feel. Similar to her friend, she's free for the first time in years. Regaining the will to live for yourself when it's been robbed from you for so long is difficult. Very difficult. In this season, she heavily relies on her feelings towards Clive, culminating in this moment here where she tries displaying that affection, yet she holds back. Things are still uncertain. Their roles in these new lives they're pursuing are not yet established. I really like how Jill goes out of her way to reassure Clive because this dude's mental state has never been lower. Keep in mind he's been presented to us as someone who suffered quite a lot. You add the fact that his reason for living never actually existed, and you see Clive at his absolute lowest. For his best friend to be there and still care after hearing the horrifying news really goes to show what kind of person she is. This does also highlight some of the flaws with the characters, but soon. Although he hasn't regained his composure fully just yet, Clive musters up the courage, and alongside Jill and Torgal, the three make their way to Phoenix Gate. Once you've reached the dungeon's end, Clive and Jill find this odd painting depicting what I can only imagine is the ultimate form of Ifrit. This image, however, sends Clive into a fit that transports him back to the scene of the memory he's been trying to escape. Some of you might think this is repetitive and to a degree a little annoying, but in my eyes, this extra context is 100% necessary. You get to see Clive finally come to terms and out loud accept what happened as he strives to create a new path for himself. And the way it's executed? Mwah, magnifique. Look at Clive's hand shake as he extends it once time has come to a halt. Look at the lip quiver as he stammers to find the words to speak, and it culminates with the moment you've all been waiting for. After a duel with Ifrit himself, Clive comes face to face with his literal shadow, the part of himself that's holding him back from achieving his true potential. You can't wield the most powerful dominant in the realm without coming to terms with what's happened and what will inevitably come. If you seek the power-hungry fantasy only this franchise can provide, behold and accept the truth.
Together, then. It's time to find out who we are, once and for all. Show yourself, Ifrit.
Holy Sephiroth. This is a moment for the gamers. I can't be objective here. This is like some of the coolest shit you will ever conceive. Nothing in this series even comes close to this level of hype. Fuck man, doing this all with the Buster Sword is just a bonus. It's almost uncanny to see Clive Rossfield swing the most iconic weapon in these games with such grace. Cloud could never wield this bad boy with this level of swagger. You'll notice a theme with these climactic battles. You'll feel and express so many different things in the span of a short 20 minutes. It's jarring, yet in all the best ways. Even if things are swinging, like a pendulum, they're building off each other. The push and pull nature of this battle again feels like a roller coaster. As Clive starts to feel overwhelmed, the shadow is significantly more aggressive, but when Clive primes himself, he takes full control of every interaction. When it comes to the grandeur of it all, I find Naoki Yoshida's take on things to be particularly interesting. He was asked about previously describing Final Fantasy XVI as if riding an intense roller coaster. He goes on to say it's a combination of all these things. The dramatic scenes and set pieces, the real-time action, and the iconic scuffles are what he believed would give the player the most breathtaking experience possible. Something that really stood out to me was this line where he talks about his original idea and what the inspiration behind it was.
My idea for Final Fantasy XVI was to bring to life the feeling of playing the lead in an epic motion picture. The same thing I felt when I played through the original Final Fantasy. It's a white-knuckle roller coaster ride in video game form.
I find Yoshi P to be a very fascinating creator. Whenever I research anything about him, I always come away finding something new to appreciate from his works. Whenever I talk about these developers in this manner, I always take each quote with a huge grain of salt, because more often than not, what they think of their product is rarely what I tend to believe. But with Yoshi P, and pretty much everyone else involved, whatever they say, I usually just take at face value. Because when I'm engaging with such an epic moment like the battle with the Infernal Shadow, I can see everything they say in the final product we have. To get a better understanding of Yoshi P as a creator, I wanted to take some time to play one of his earlier titles, so I finally played Final Fantasy XIV. While not the original lead, Yoshi P is widely regarded as the savior of 14 after the infamous 1.0 release. It's so weird how similar these two games are to each other. Sounds dumb, I know, but regardless of its MMO status, walking around the lands of Eorzea, participating in fates as I came across them, I noticed where 16 seems to get a lot of its inspiration. I am not even a third of the way into A Realm Reborn yet, so I haven't seen nearly enough of it. Yet in my brief time, I could see almost the skeleton of what 16 would end up following. It is very different, yet familiar all the same. Regardless, now that Clive's accepted the truth truth he's been running away from, he, alongside Jill, can fully devote themselves to Sid's cause. Combined with all the intel from earlier, it's when Clive reaches Northreach where he finds the resolve to fully commit to his mentor's ideals. Clive meets the Dame, the unofficial leader of Northreach, and it's through her quests where you learn more about the bearers as people. This one side quest has Clive delivering meals to some of the bearers who are currently working. Whenever he approaches one of them, the bearers are almost shocked that they aren't being scolded. This torture isn't just from an outside force, mind you. These bearers have suffered so much their mental state has been shattered. They inflict suffering upon themselves by working through injury and holding off on meals. This one bearer here, I can't even imagine what someone has to go through to come to the conclusion he does when Clive tells him to rest. I think once something like that's really settled with you, it makes a lot of sense for Clive to follow Sid's cause. I'm about to make a wild comparison. I think the way Final Fantasy XVI handles Clive's character arc is very similar to Shulk from the first Xenoblade Chronicles. Both characters embark on a quest for revenge after losing someone close to them. As they explore the world, they learn new things about it, and as they come to understand the realm better, it allows them to make those crucial decisions only the protagonist could. It works because it shows that our main character is one that has the ability to change. So often you play a game and the character's journey leaves you wanting more because the main story didn't offer enough. Final Fantasy XVI does leave me wanting more, but in all the best ways. Which brings us to the finale of Season 3. Clive, Sid, and Jill take the path of Goddess so they can destroy the Mother Crystal in Oriflamme, the capital of Sanbreque. Once Sid destroys the Mother Crystal, however, a being known as Typhon slips through a rift in space and starts attacking our trio. Clive gets another headache, and alongside this, Abomination gets transported to a realm of utter nothingness. Bro, what am I even looking at? You do get a pretty sick multi-phase boss fight with the Typhon itself, and that's pretty neat, but out of all the spectacular moments in Final Fantasy XVI, this is one of the weaker ones. In all honesty, this battle is being carried so hard by the stellar soundtrack. Most of the soundtrack focuses on epic fantasy as the backdrop. You know, the da-na, na-na, 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 na-na. Yeah, that. This shit doesn't even sound like it's from the same game. Fuck the same series, but holy moly, what a banger. Dude, I can't even pronounce the title of this song, yet this beat lives rent-free in my head. After defeating Typhon, Clive is transported back to the real world where he finds Sid on the verge of death. Before he can pass, the three are visited by the real antagonist of Final Fantasy XVI, Ultima. After a few attempts to claim Clive, Ultima is eventually sealed away by the returning Joshua Rossfield, because of course he wasn't dead. I am intentionally being vague right now because my feelings on what I just described can be tied to many of the things we're going to be talking about very soon. Plus, I promised myself that I keep this video under 2 hours, and I'm on page 31 of the script as I'm typing this out right now, so let's move on.
The Chink in the Crystal.
One of the more personal reasons I wanted to talk about Final Fantasy XVI again was because I felt I needed to amend some of the things I said in that first video. Part of the problem with being really excited during that first playthrough is I went a little overboard and genuinely had almost nothing negative to say about the narrative at all. For as much as I regret saying those things, I still feel I was totally valid at that time. My videos have never been crafted to tell you what you should or should not play. Rather, I want to focus on my experience with the game in question tied to a larger overarching point. As much fun as it was to experience the narrative with rose-tinted glasses that first playthrough, I made sure they were off this time. And yeah, there's definitely some issues. The strength of both the introduction and the young adult time periods of Clive were the fact they weren't too long, and because of that, the game can devote the necessary time to develop these characters. But then that's the issue with trying to tell an epic, isn't it? When you have so much grandeur, so much stuff going on, it's almost impossible for everything and everyone to be given the proper amount of time to really flesh things out. And when this season starts in the year of the realm 878, these cracks start to chink the very crystal that's meant to remain pure. Take, for instance, the very first thing you do after the time skip, returning to the Iron Kingdom to destroy the Mother Crystal. This is meant to be the area where the spotlight is on Jill. After spending 13 years, this was meant to be her redemption tour on her way back. We get glimpses of the people she was protecting while enduring the Iron Kingdom suffering. It's just, that's all we get. Glimpses. This isn't to say that any of it is bad, mind you. Not at all. I find Jill's arc in the narrative quite enjoyable. There's just not enough of it. It's hard for me to get invested when Jill reunites with someone I'm told was very important to her during her captivity, but then we just move on to the dungeon like it wasn't a big deal, with her explaining who this person was via slow walking sections. I just find it very hard to believe that Jill, this character who gets plenty of screen time and is meant to be the story's main love interest, doesn't really get a conclusion I deem satisfying. In the moment, it's hype as shit, but I like to see some of the pain Jill had to endure before she comes face to face with the person responsible for all this suffering. I know the thought of adding more scenes here is like, dear God, no. But here, a flashback wouldn't just be nice, but almost necessary. This is probably the most emotion Jill showcases in the entire narrative, and I can't really understand why she's so upset other than what was shown at the beginning of the game. Again, the set piece itself is so fucking cool, man. Shiva moved up a few spots on my icon tier list after her performance here, but as cathartic as it was to see her stick it to the man who made her suffer, I just don't think it quite lands the way it was intended to. I come away with the feeling, wow, that was really cool, rather than, oh my god, she deserves this, slay queen reaction that the devs expected me to have. It's not bad, it's just not that great. The thing that bothers me is this is something that can be applied to virtually the majority of the cast. It's wild to me how underutilized Hugo Kupka is in the narrative of Final Fantasy XVI. In the first scene he's shown, you get the sense this guy is definitely a player of the game. This guy knows what it means to advance to the peak of Valisthea's society. Conniving isn't the right word. This man is a bastard in the literal sense. He's initially portrayed as someone who's willing to do whatever it takes to achieve his own goals. Too bad it only lasts as long as Hugo does in bed. I really don't want to sound like the thirstiest man alive, but I genuinely enjoy the scene where Benedicta and Hugo hook up, for lack of more appropriate phrasing, if only for the fact that it's just insane to me that a Final Fantasy game of all things would tread in this direction. But this is where Hugo's major character flaw rears its ugly head. I said this last time and I made sure to really pay attention when playing this time around just to make sure I wasn't missing anything, but no. For as smart as Hugo is, we never really see that due to his unconditional love towards Benedicta. He's a great character for us to explore the concept of power and what it can do when it consumes us. After his lover's death, all Hugo seeks is more strength to attain the revenge he obsessively seeks. In that way, I guess it's charming, but it's his motive that bothers me. Let me tell you what Kupka's official title is. He is listed as the Economic Advisor of the Dalmekian Republic. If you know anything about Game of Thrones or any sort of media like this, you'll know that this is just a pseudo title for essentially the guy who runs the show. It's just very jarring to me that the smartest man of the biggest geographical kingdom in the realm will toss all that aside because his girl was murdered. Like, how down bad do you have to be to end up like this? Bro was so love-struck he didn't even notice he was getting played either. You see the main issue now? Hugo is kind of a big dingus. And that's not to say that I don't like him. It's just that when I realized this, it takes away from his aura. When he first walked into a room, this man had an obscene amount of presence. All eyes would gravitate towards him. That effect still happens, but when he's throwing a fit like this upon receiving Benedicta's head, I can't really buy into him being the all-important advisor the game claims him to be. Doesn't take away from his boss fight though, which remains the base game's peak in terms of spectacle. This is where the Eikon fights take a huge step forward for action nuts like myself. Now that Clive has accepted the truth, he now has full command over Ifrit, and now moves around with the swagger only a dominant is capable of. Clive also showcases his ability to adapt to these gargantuan threats by literally, and I'm not joking, literally stealing Titan's Raging Fist ability in real time as they trade blows. Need I even mention the fight with Titan Lost? A battle with a cacophony of Earth so large, Clive has to run across the entire landscape to start his assault. I just don't understand how you can look at what I'm showing you on screen right now and think this isn't Final Fantasy. In every form of the words, it absolutely is. A clash so big an entire city cannot contain it, featuring iconic beings going toe-to-toe with each other, showcasing the peak of their abilities at this point, banger music playing, hit one-liners such as it has everything. How? how is this not the final boss? You actually expect things to get better than this? I think it was here when I realized, yeah, this is probably the greatest game of all time. I could literally handpick so many moments that could compete for this claim, but I always turn back to the moment where Clive says the game is over, and I turn to the person next to me and say, oh yeah, this is a video game by the way. But as exciting as it is, I remember that Hugo, the man commanding this enormous abomination, is doing this because he lost his girl. It's not a reason I can't believe. It's just one that I can't really buy into. I want to clarify again that none of these flaws are anything I would label as bad. You rip any of these and insert them into the remake trilogy and they would easily be remembered as the best moments. But in a game that has so many standout moments, some inevitably get lost in the shuffle. Hugo Kupka as a character is one of them. Such a shame. I feel like there was more to explore, but the way it is, I'm honey-dicked in the worst possible fashion. This is the big issue with a narrative that has time skips. You end up building so much and introduce so many different characters that there isn't enough time to conclude all these arcs in a satisfying way. For all I know, it could be intentional. Sometimes things don't turn out the way you want them to. I'm just annoyed because I never got a chance to figure out if it was something I wanted. I'm left befuddled, a feeling that's constant throughout my experiences with these games. And unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. Okay, I'm about to drop the hottest take I'll ever say on this channel. I don't really get the appeal of Dion Lesage. Wait, hold on, just 1 second now. Let me explain. God. Similar to my thoughts on the rest of the characters I find underwhelming, I actually love Dion. He has all the characteristics I want from someone who's playing that lone wolf tragedy persona. But again, there's not enough time to focus on why he's doing what he's doing. Unlike Jill and Hugo, Dion actually gets a more fleshed out reason for going berserk. I adore the scene where Ultima shows up and reveals that Olivier, Annabella's thoroughbred son, was created the same way Anakin Skywalker was. Another blink and you'll miss a type moment, and it's so brilliantly executed, but again, it's just not enough. There was a chill that ran down my entire body when Dion's stepbrother looked up and uttered the words, Kinslayer. That shit is ice fucking cold. That's what we call bars, bruh. But it's the messiest plotline of the entire narrative. If I'm being totally honest here, I think all this was conjured up so we can include Bahamut as the big boss of this area. Because think about it, all Dion really does is try to warn his father of Ultima's influence. Obviously he's not successful, so he decides that his only choice is to nuke the entirety of the capital? Okay. Again, the individual moments and visual set pieces themselves are brilliant. First class, best in industry level stuff. But that feeling I had fighting the Infernal Shadow isn't what I got here, or anything that could surpass it. It's very cool, just not that cool, you know? To be fair, I can't throw too much shade Dion's way. After all, he's what? Only the second user of light magic to use the infamous Zeta Flare spell? And in such bombastic fashion, I might add. It's hilarious to me that the only person to share this honor is Donald Duck from the Kingdom Hearts games. Elite company, I'd say. I just don't get the crazy admiration Dion gets. I think he serves his role really well, almost acting like an alternate version of Clive, but none of that is explored in the main story or anything. As far as that's concerned, Dion is laser focused on going after Ultima. If you want to get more out of Dion's story, you can engage with the myriad of side quests in this final act of the narrative. It is a majority of this act's runtime, and I do love all of these side activities. It's a great opportunity to spend time not only with Dion, but with some of the other overlooked characters. It's through these side quests where a lot more backstory of these people is given to us. Take for example this one here where Clive wants to show Jill a field of her favorite flowers. She opens up about the great deal of suffering she went through and how she learns it was this path she needed to take to lead her back to Clive. It's a shame we still don't get to see any of it, but whatever. At least it's something. I can't really extend that sentiment to Dion over here. We do learn more about his backstory, but that is tied to another character in the Hideaway, our resident lore master Harpocrates. Apparently before he joined Sid's cause, Harpo Man over here was in service directly to Dion when he was still heir to his father's throne. It's cute that these characters have this connection, but again, we are told about their expansive relationship rather than shown. Even during the side quest itself, neither Dion or Harpo are really relevant. They just want Clive to grab the thing for them so we can watch the cutscene. I'm being told that Dion was always very important to Harpo, but I have to ask, how How can I believe this when the extent of this interaction is one scene? That's pretty much the case for all of these characters. They all introduce these really interesting plot lines, but none of them go anywhere meaningful because, oh yeah, there's a giant-ass crystal in the sky we need to destroy. None of this is anything I would classify as bad, or something that makes me want to pull my hair out. Not at all. But I definitely wanted more. Hugo Kupka, in concept, is very fascinating and could have been the sleeper villain of the narrative. Dion Lesage is the perfect archetype for a redemption story. But with the content on offer, we never get to fully realize all these ambitious character traits. And Jill, God, what did they do to you, my sweet princess? I know I just kinda speed ran a majority of the stuff that happens in this section, but in all honesty, that's kind of how it feels. You'll bypass all the new things these characters are doing to focus on resolving plotlights from the beginning of the game. Of course, I am talking about the legendary reunion of Clive and Joshua. After defeating Bahamut together with the combined power of Ifrit and the Phoenix, the two finally have a moment to embrace each other. This isn't the first time they've crossed paths since that infamous day in the year 860, but it's the first time they've both been conscious to comprehend the fact that the other is okay. It's a heartwarming moment I can look at in this mess of a plotline with some fondness, but that doesn't erase everything that led us here. I realized during these moments that this story more or less revolves around two major characters. Everyone else is meant to enhance both Clive and his enemy, Ultima. That isn't to disregard everyone else. After all, I'd say the game's final obstacle before the big duel with Ultima himself is actually done very well. Barnabas Tharmir is a villain I believe goes overlooked. He's easily the calmest out of Valisthea's main leaders, and he's without a doubt the most deadly. By the time he and Clive meet for the first time, he's gone full Akashic. Humanity is something beneath him, and his title as ruler of Waloed means nothing anymore. He is fully devoted to Ultima now. In this instance, I think not giving us any more than we already have works here because fundamentally, these two are on two different wavelengths. Clive is still doing his best to carry Sid's dream of freedom and equality for all, while Barnabas is acting like the mad king just reveling in what Ultima has created as they trade blows with one another.
And now that its sweet ruin courses through my veins, I shall not be quick to relinquish it. Show me your work, Mythos, that I might revel in it!
While none of these particular moments grab me in that obsessive way I personally would want it to, the show being put on carries these moments so unbelievably hard. I know I spent not an insignificant amount of time really highlighting all the cracks 16's narrative suffers from as you get deeper into it, but that's all they are. Cracks. It's never the way things play out or the motive that bothers me. I just want more, dude. I want to spend more time with Jill. I want to form a meaningful friendship with Dion. I want to learn more about Hugo and Barnabas, but I can't. This game is already dummy long as it is, clocking in at about 70 hours for just the base game if you go out of your way to do everything. So I guess in that way I can respect them for not going overboard. But I think we could have skimmed a few side quests here to add more meaningful dialogue between people we actually care about. I love all of these side quests, especially the endgame ones that focus on these iconic locations. But if it means we have to hinder some of these characters to have more world stuff, I can happily do without them. Seriously, how does a character like the Dame get more development than one of the main villains? Fuck, dude, that's brutal. I went into insane detail on the intro and early portion of the story because it was so focused that I could really immerse myself in all the details. Characters like Sid had fully realized arcs and the rest of the main cast were able to grow alongside those story moments. I just can't do that here because nothing really comes full circle in the way I'd like. You definitely notice the holes coming back a second time, and that's quite a shame because one last time, none of it is actually bad content. None of it is poorly written or animated or whatever. There's just not enough of it. It leaves me wanting more in ways that I enjoy, but I still want fucking more. Luckily, Naoki Yoshida sensed this might be an issue and graced us with some new content in the form of DLC. I usually don't talk about DLC in depth in my videos because I honestly never go back to play them myself, but when you're talking about your favorite game of all time, exceptions have to be made.
Another journey, another story.
Seeing as how I'll be discussing all the new content available for the first time, I just need to clarify one thing. This is not my first time experiencing either of these paid sub stories. I made sure to go through them in depth a second time through, so no rose-tinted shades to be seen, alright? With all that said, yeah, this ship goes pretty fucking hard. Let's start with the Echoes of the Fallen. Before proceeding back to your origin, Karen, the main shopkeeper at the hideaway, tells Clive about this weird crystal she came across. Unlike normal crystals that have a blue hue to them, this one was cast with a shade of dark purple and would shatter after only a few uses. After scouring Valisthea long enough, Clive, Jill, and Joshua run into Famil, the merchant responsible for these crystals circulating the market. You're forced to chase this shady bastard and his goons around for a while. Eventually, it leads you to the Sage Spire, revealing the true culprit of these corrupt crystals, the Fallen. These guys aren't strangers to Valisthea, as the Fallen were an ancient society that roamed the realm before the Age of Dominance. You'll come across their influence in the base game for sure, but it was all building up to this. While we've been focused on taking Ultima down, the Fallen have been plotting in the background. Their motives aren't exactly known, but from what we can gather when we reunite with Famil, it seems like the Fallen have been attempting to manufacture their own Mother Crystal in an attempt to delay Ultima's awakening. And when it comes to the story of Echoes of the Fallen, that's really all there is. Not even kidding. There's no new character arcs to be explored, there's no new consequences to the main plot. All that can really be gleaned from all this is new lore to one of the many things inhabiting Valisthea. It's cool that you get little tidbits of information as you make your way up the tower, but if you were expecting some of those plot holes to get fixed here, sorry chief, this ain't it. That doesn't mean your time will be wasted should you decide to seek the truth about the Fallen. The Sage Spire is probably the most elaborate dungeon in the entire game, and it is a damn sight to behold. You add in that eerie organ in the background that ramps up with each combat encounter, ooh yeah, that's the stuff. However, this really is just a boss rush tower. Pretty much you walk to a place, fight some enemies, walk through the door they were guarding, and fight the boss. As simple as it may sound, it's within these combat challenges where the Echoes of the Fallen DLC really shines. The difficulty is dialed up to a new level, asking the player to find new solutions to defeat these machines. Each boss encounter has its own unique challenges to encounter. Take for instance this boss here. He's just a remixed form of the Ahriman Huntboard variation, but now infected by the Fallen's Mother Crystal, he's equipped with a variety of new skills. Fucking Eyeball from Monster Tamer over here has a room clearing move. Like, what? There are all new enemy types to see here, but what I find most interesting are the remixed ones. It's a very subtle yet nice way of showing the world adapt to every looming threat. In concept, everything should die as soon as they're infected, but it shows the unique physiology of these monsters without actually telling you. It's nice. However, if there is one thing this exclusive content has that's worth experiencing, it's that insane final boss. Once you've reached the top to destroy the Mother Crystal, the Sage Spire kicks in its final defense. The manufactured icon of the Fallen, Omega. At first, it doesn't seem like this Star Wars reject is much of a threat, but this is just the appetizer. When things really kick in, well, I think it's better if you see for yourself.
Alright. I'm convinced.
Oh my god. This is fucking spectacle, y'all. Do you see what's happening on screen here? My brain can't process what my eyes are witnessing. The vaporwave dressing on top of the fantasy aesthetic blends together marvelously. It doesn't look out of place at all, and that is doubly so for the music. Similar to the track against Typhon, Iconoclasm is a piece that doesn't even feel like it's a part of the same game as the main battle music. Like, it still has the opera in the background, but this shit's like trap music, bro. Get this shit bumping in the club and it'll have everybody hitting the yam harder than any other track could. And again, it's thematic of the situation present. It sounds unfamiliar, similar to the location we're in, but it has the right hook to get the player to keep going. For as difficult as every challenge is in Final Fantasy XVI, nothing even comes close to the level of proficiency you need to have to even stand a chance against this thing. He is easily the most aggressive boss in the entire game. He uses the entire arena as his playground to toy with you. If you aren't hyper-focused on every input you make, you're going to lose. When I'm this far into a game, normally I have a set way I've built up so any encounter wouldn't really pose an issue. It might take a few attempts, but eventually I'd get there. This mindset, surprise surprise, did not work against the Fallen's ultimate defense system. To my understanding, Final Fantasy mode will always have the player at a severe level disadvantage should you opt not to grind. So I already knew I wasn't going to beat this thing in a contest of strength alone. I had to win the mind game. It's ironic that after putting it away for a while, I turned to Titan's JoJo Punch once again to bail me out. While its main function is to deal multiple punches in a short burst, its secondary function is what's really going to help me out here. If you time it right, you can actually use this skill as a parry. It does not matter what type of skill your enemy is using. If they make contact with Titan's fist in that split second, the parry will cancel their attack. I was able to use this exploit on one of Omega's finishing moves. He darted in like a bullet, but I was there to stop him in his tracks. I legitimately started cackling like a mad scientist when this happened. All that frustration, all that fear turned into pure action bliss, and from there, it was all over for the Fallen. This is without a shadow of a doubt the most exciting the game gets. It is the absolute peak of the combat. There is no challenge from a gameplay standpoint that even touches this one. But sadly, that's all there really is. Once you've experienced this fight, everything building up to it isn't nearly as memorable. The Sage Spire is an awesome location, but you're really here for this boss battle. It's not like the resolution itself is satisfying. Right before destroying the Mother Crystal, Famil shows up and begs Clive not to destroy it, as he and his people rely on the funds the crystals bring in. It takes all of one line from Clive here to completely change their minds, and then we just move on. Nobody learned anything from this adventure. Is this worth the price of admission? I don't know. That's something only you can decide. I think I got something out of it, but in all honesty, this was a very weak showing. The Omega fight is really all I can take away from this. Luckily for us, the next DLC fares a bit better. Again, before returning to our origin, Clive receives a missive from a random stranger essentially asking to meet. All that we know is this has to do with the only dominant we haven't encountered yet, Leviathan the Lost. When Clive destroys the Mother Crystals, not only is the magic in Valisthea weakened, but the line of the Eikon in that region will end. As you've concluded each region's story arc, both in the main campaign and through the side objective, you'll notice one thing. The war-torn Valisthea we walked into isn't the same Valisthea we're in now. Things have changed, and besides a few ruffians and the Akashic, the realm has been able to find a bit of peace. Each kingdom focuses on its own development and through mutual interest and trade, build relationships with one another. It may have seemed silly at first, but it looks like Cid's dream wasn't a hopeless one after all. With Leviathan's presence now known, this presents a huge problem to the realm. There's a growing fear that should its presence become known, the kingdoms will wage war against one another once more. So Clive and the gang make haste for the coastline to meet this stranger. Upon our arrival, the stranger introduces herself as Shula, tributary of Mysidia, final haven of the moats of water. Long way of saying she is the last person in the line who can inherit Leviathan as a dominant. The reason Shula seeks Clive's help is because the wave frozen near Mysidia was actually an act of rage by Leviathan itself, and for over a century it has remained frozen. Seeing as how Clive has his own interests in mind, he and the gang decide to assist Shula with what is otherwise an impossible task. I gotta be honest here, when it comes to the story of the rising tide, while improved, isn't really the reason I'm here, to be honest. It is very cool to introduce Leviathan into the story of Final Fantasy XVI, and on its own it's fine. There's just not enough for me to latch onto. I wasn't really looking to learn about a new character and their backstory. I was kind of looking to flesh out the characters we've been neglecting. I might be wrong here, but I'm pretty sure the director of the DLC said this was going to be a good opportunity for us to focus on Jill. Apparently Mysidia is the northern territory the game teased us with earlier. Maybe I missed something throughout my 2 playthroughs of the Rising Tide, but I have no idea what this guy means when he says this. Like, what Jill content is he talking about here? It's not like she's a total spectator, but when I heard we'd be visiting her homeland, I figured we'd take the opportunity to see more of her backstory. She was taken at a very young age to a foreign land, maybe a flashback to the day where Elwyn showed up to take her. There's so many angles for you to approach this from, and you go with nothing? More important information being conveyed via slow walking sections? Seriously? Why is Joshua even here? Oh, so he can be the token butt of every joke as he thirsts over Shula? Really? Look, I'm exaggerating. None of this really hinders the experience, but it is such a wasted opportunity. I get the feeling you could replace Clive's companions with anyone else. Toss Gav and Otto in there and not much would change narratively. The lore and the implications of the Lost Eikon's presence are fascinating, but when it's attached to what I consider a pretty ass plot, it's pretty hard for me to really care about all that. Guess I should explain why we're here, huh? So Shula does want us to destroy the mother crystal known as the Surge so Leviathan's dominant can be freed from its prison. Leviathan's dominant, however, is a young infant named Walies. He's been the key holding the Surge together. Apparently, Shula's ancestors meant to enrage Leviathan to a point where they could sustain the ether power continuously. This, combined with her ancestors' ability to stop time, meant they could see a society that prospers rather than suffers, but at the cost of one child. Shula believes this to be wrong and wants to free Walies, the lad containing Leviathan's dominance, so he could live his own life. It is a noble quest in that sense, but goddamn, was a new character really needed here? I like Shula. She has enough going on where I perk up every time she speaks, but she has been given nothing to work with. We are just meant to believe she's like the noblest person ever, that out of the goodness of her heart she wants us to save Walies. In a world where every person in some fashion has a selfish goal attached to them, it's kinda hard for me to suspend my disbelief that someone in Valisthea is just that pure-hearted. No shade against her, she's a very nice person. It's just jarring in the worst possible way. It makes her entire character come off very fake to me, like it was cobbled together because they had to attach something to justify Leviathan being separate from the base game. I may have been a little harsh with all that, but honestly, that's just how I feel. But again, you're not here for the story, you're here for everything else.
Welcome, my friends, to Mysidia.
Wow, okay. Mysidia is probably the best looking thing ever in a video game. Location, set piece, visual, artistic design, what the fuck ever. It is the best in all categories. Nothing even comes close. Gone are the gray skies we've had to endure the last 30 hours. In Mysidia, the sky has never been brighter. The sun's rays perfectly cast along the water, and that's not even mentioning the actual details. Dude, the path to the Surge. Oh my god. You slowly approach Walies' prison and the particle effects are so on point, even the characters have to remark on it. The way these water droplets just hang frozen, like, are you kidding me? When it comes to new entries in this franchise, so much has to be done to account for what's come before. References are all well and good, and series staples must be abided by. But what makes the games in this series truly legendary is that extra bit of sauce. Final Fantasy XVI's interpretation of this are all the little details we often neglect. It's just mind-blowing to me that as I roam around the land of Mysidia, the Surge and all the gorgeous scenery attached to it is right there for me to look at whenever I want. And what you're actually doing is pretty sick too. The main quest might suffer from some issues, but I think this is where the side content of the game shines. These are the people you're going to want to talk to if you want to learn more about this region. There is an entire side quest that's focused just around Tonberries. I'm not joking. Apparently, the Tonberries have the ability to curse those nearby that are grieving, and a citizen of Mysidia has unfortunately fallen under the curse. You actually get to learn more about the Tonberries as creatures. Sure, it's just told directly to you, but it's such a neat little detail the game doesn't need to go out of its way to point out, but it does. And as a Final Fantasy fanatic, I love every little bit of it. Not to mention, this leads us to a fight with the Tonberry King himself. This is a game of dominance after all, and the King of Berries won't relinquish his throne so easily. You seriously gonna sit there and tell me in the comments that this isn't Final Fantasy? But okay, maybe an optional side quest isn't enough to convince you of 16's Final Fantasy-ness, but I think this next one will. The battle against Leviathan as a whole is pretty good. It's definitely not the best even with its multi-phase structure, but it reaches the peak in one key area. I mentioned earlier that the Ifrit fights are more for spectacle rather than gameplay, and I still believe that. Fighting Bahamut in this epic void-like arena is pretty sick, but it's definitely not the most engaging. That's not the case here. Leviathan is not an icon to be messed with. He's playing a whole different game than all the other dominants. This is the fight that determines whether or not you're built for these types of games. You thought Radahn in Elden Ring was difficult? Nah, he's a pushover when compared to Leviathan the Lost here. The difficulty spike here is immense. yet I wasn't at all frustrated. I died so many times in the armor phase here, and it was through all these attempts where I realized I had to start thinking differently. Clive has two main supers he can rely on when he's in Ifrit mode: Brimstone and Spitflare. Knowing when to use these skills is so important to getting past this part. The trick is using Spitflare as soon as you reload into the fight. This will automatically skip that first time he pushes you back, giving you that extra bit of time you need to end this phase of the fight. This single Sekiro level action I needed to figure out was the difference between me winning and losing. I'm sorry, if that's not the coolest fucking thing ever, I don't know what is. How many games, let alone Final Fantasy titles, have this level of depth in the part of the combat that's meant to be more of a spectacle than a challenge? Playing Final Fantasy mode does help in that regard, but I remember catching a beating my first go around too. Also, let's not forget the scenery here because, oh my god, I'm amazed that this is still running at anything even close to 60 frames a second. This encounter takes place on a literal ocean, not some landmass surrounding a body of water, but on the water itself. And that skybox is just so fitting. Mysidia is the home to the most beautiful sight of the sky Valisthea can offer. It makes sense that Leviathan's overcast would just add to the beauty of it all. Seeing it all in motion is just wild. It makes no sense. What kind of mind had to conceive this? I have my problems with both of the DLCs, sure, but I'd be lying if I said these moments weren't worth the journey. It's my favorite summon in Final Fantasy because the moments that are attached to the serpent are always memorable. I was a little worried to see how it would all play out, and it's not spotless, but Leviathan definitely earns his place among the other icons and without a doubt beats all of them in terms of spectacle. I said earlier that Titan was the best boss in the base game, and that's still true, but when it comes to Final Fantasy XVI as a whole? Oh buddy, nothing is touching this. I don't even care that the story attached to it was kind of poopy. The fight was that good. Lots of moments of euphoria are had throughout your time in Valisthea, but nothing can top inputting that final QTE as I breakest thy head. The DLC of Final Fantasy XVI is very weird for me to talk about. There's a lot I really like and enjoy coming back to every time I plop my disc into my PS5 Pro. But when you're talking about an additional $30 on top of the base game's price, the issues become harder to stomach. I had a lot of fun exploring these new areas, but I was doing a lot of that work myself. I was slowing down, opening up photo mode to really take in the vistas. I let every line of dialogue play out again, even though I already knew what they were going to say. I went out of my way to fight every new monster, even though I didn't have to. I got a lot out of it, but it really is asking a lot for what you get in return. 2 new stories that underwhelm in pretty much every way, and lore that is interesting, but not enough to satisfy. Again, I'm not a game reviewer. I'll never tell you what you should or should not buy, but I think it's worth saying that I think this DLC is intended for those who really liked Final Fantasy XVI. If you didn't like the base game, there's a higher chance hell freezes over than you enjoying what's on offer. At the end of the day, this is just more Final Fantasy XVI. I love this game, so I think that all sounds great, even if it does let me down a bit. But the fact remains, it did let me down. None of it ties to the plot holes these opportunities could have resolved. None of the main characters involved take anything meaningful from these adventures. Nothing I wanted out of these DLCs happened besides a few cool moments. That's really a shame, because you can tell that at least some of this content was something that the team really wanted to make. In an interview with MMORPG before the Rising Tide's release earlier this year, Yoshi P spoke at length about how the Rising Tide was meant to be another main quest in the game. When it came to revisiting this content after the game's release, Yoshi P kept things blunt.
That said, we left it as an idea. If the fans loved the game and they wanted more, we could come back to this final Leviathan, this final icon, and tell its story. We then released the game. Fans loved it, they want to see more, and so we were able to go with as we already had this idea. Now we can finally make Leviathan be lost found and tell that story, and that's kind of where we are.
We, the loyal fans did enjoy the game. A lot, in fact. Revisiting cut content makes sense. It allows you to fully flesh out your vision after all. But that's kind of the problem. None of this content feels organic. It doesn't add to the tale of the Mother Crystal in any meaningful way. It really is cut content they polished up a bit and slapped the DLC tag on. Maybe this isn't the best way to describe it, but it feels kinda cheap? Like the actual production less so, but the impact. It feels so artificial. I mainly attribute that to adding new characters that really don't need to be here, but still, it does feel very separate from the base game in that regard. This is why I don't cover DLC, because rarely does it ever enhance the story in the ways that it should. You're paying an extra fee for content that is locked from the game. That alone should justify something that the base game can't offer. Technically speaking, both of the Echoes of the Fallen and the Rising Tide do this, but in the ways that matter to Final Fantasy, it doesn't do it enough. The set pieces and window dressing is very much appreciated, and I'll never forget my time in the Sage Spire or Mysidia. But to be honest, I just don't care about the reason for being dragged here. It's a shame, but to be honest, when you look at some of the other DLCs offered in this series, these aren't actually so bad. In that regard, I should consider myself lucky. Okay, no more stalling. Let's talk about Ultima and wrap this up.
Final Fantasy, no more.
When the world came to be, Ultima stumbled upon a realm blessed with a miracle, magic, and through it all the life spread across flourished. But this came at the cost of a black pall dimming the skies, the infection we know as the Blight. This phenomenon was too much for Ultima to overcome, so he fled in means of finding salvation. But to achieve this, Ultima would need a land that has yet to be corrupted. So he settled on one place, a land as he puts it that's as pure as driven snow, Valisthea. It's here where he could begin the proper work to achieve his paradise. It was through the pure ether of Valisthea where Ultima would create the Mother Crystals to act as siphons of power. How to collect all this magical power was the tricky part. So, he does what a god would naturally do. He created the entire human race present in Valisthea as a means to have them use magic power for the Mother Crystals to store. Those war scenes we've been watching weren't a part of some kingdom's desire for power at all. It was all a means for Ultima to get closer to achieve his goals. That, however, is only part one of the plan. For Ultima to walk the domain he so eagerly seeks to create, he must form a vessel suitable for his needs. He then turns to Clive, demanding his mythos return to his side to serve the purpose he created him for. As the creator of the world, he now descends to claim which he believes is his. However, something unexpected stands in his way. The very population he created garnered a will of their own, and it's through Clive where humanity will stand shoulder to shoulder with God itself. These are the motivations for each side going into the finale, yet it was upon a second inspection where I realized a new level of depth in this conflict. On the surface, yes, this is very much the David versus Goliath story, just with that deity twist it's like with a lot of these games. But going through it again, I believe I found the true meaning behind the word shared between Ultima and his vessel. In terms of the narrative itself, this all makes perfect sense. One being who created everything comes back to claim what he's built. His creation, however, have been able to gain their own knowledge and determine what they've built during Ultima's absence is worth fighting for. Back to the central question of the video, I find this particular plot to evoke Final Fantasy in some of the best ways. I love how simple the point of the narrative is because it allows the game to focus on all the little moments. Take for instance where Ultima reveals the history of Valisthea and its purpose. This scene gets a lot of flack because it really is Ultima's PowerPoint presentation of the world's creation, but I think it works well here. This moment may not show us the stuff we want to see in favor of just telling us this information, but this is the first real time Clive and Joshua come face to face with their creator to just talk. For how neglected a lot of these characters are, I find Joshua's role here to be very interesting. While everyone else has been doing stuff related to the main plot, Joshua has been off learning more about Ultima, trying to piece together the real meaning behind the tale of the Mother Crystals. Why was Leviathan the only dominant missing? Why is Ifrit the icon Ultima models himself after? And what is the Mother Crystal's real purpose? Joshua ends up becoming our vessel to explore more of the mythos within Final Fantasy XVI. It is a shame that the bond he shares with his brother isn't fully delved into, really only resulting in a side quest where the two visit their father's grave. They do have glorious moments of brotherly love that are conveyed beautifully, but like everything everything else, we don't get enough of it. I would have preferred seeing more of that relationship kindle, but what we have does introduce a few interesting things about the narrative I never realized before. I'm about to go on a bit of a tangent to end things off here, so just go with me on this. In essence, this plot is very simple. The bad guy wants to eradicate humanity to start the world anew, while the good guy needs to stop him so his race has a chance at surviving the challenges of the new world. It is a basic battle of philosophies, but within it lies commentary on the real-life predicament Square finds themselves in. Look at everything we've been through, all the characters we've met, all the threats we've encountered. For as unique as it all is, one thing that's been true throughout it all has been the developers' love and care for the Final Fantasy name. It's why I've been so laser focused on everything with this in mind. This makes the final battle of Final Fantasy XVI particularly intriguing. Clive, Joshua, and Dion set off to Origin to confront Ultima one last time. So where is... This epic 4-phase gauntlet is the perfect showcase of story-based combat. Each QTE raises the stakes that much higher, showing how far each Eikon is willing to go to defeat their adversary. I love the image of Ultima, not even breaking a sweat as he dodges and blocks every attack, really highlighting the difference in strength between them. Every word he utters has this cool confidence laid behind it. The other three dominants are using their best stuff, and it's not even phasing him. It took a fluke shot from Dion to even make contact with this brother. Now that is presence. This, however, is just the opening act. Once you've entered the Nexus, Ultima finally reveals the Mother Crystal's true purpose. Yes, they were meant to store the ether magic from everything in the realm of Valisthea. However, the purpose of what the creator would do with this power was never explained. Multiple vessels of Ultima appear to Clive and Joshua's shock, yet with their arrival, the pieces have finally all come together.
You meant for us to destroy the Mother Crystals. It's what you wanted all along.
You have our gratitude, Ethos.
That's right. Ultima, from the very beginning, designed the Mother Crystals to be destroyed, so when their energy was released, he could claim and spread it across his vessels hiding throughout the land, with Clive being the penultimate vessel brimming with all the powers of the Eikons. This reunion comes at the cost of Joshua's life, yet he has no fear as he entrusts mankind's fate into Clive one final time. The word I'd use to describe it all is exhilarated. The fight itself is no joke. Sure, I don't really have much trouble taking him down nowadays, but I still feel in danger. If I'm not absolutely on point, he will slaughter me as Omega and Leviathan did before. Spreading it across multiple phases tests your endurance as a player in all the best ways. New mechanics, new combat interactions are always happening. Ultima still is the culmination of every single enemy we've faced in Valisthea thus far, still resulting in the most challenging fight in the game. But at level 100, and with Ultima's own blade in my hand, I can help Clive reach the potential his creator has sought after for so long. It is a really cool final boss that, shocker, deserves its place amongst the rest of the entries that came before. What's more interesting, however, is the meta commentary that's on full display. Yeah, we're really going there. Pay close attention to what Ultima says during the first phase.
Countless centuries have I waited for this moment in which I might revel in my creation, only to find it profaned and so it must be cleansed.
Isn't the phrasing here just a bit too convenient? Why would he say it like that? So I thought about it some more. I believe that Ultima is simultaneously meant to represent both fans and SquareEnix. With an IP that's been around for as long as this one has, certain expectations need to be met. On the fan side, this needs to feel like Final Fantasy. And on the shareholder side, obviously certain sales expectations need to be reached for future game development. Ultima symbolizes those who aren't involved with the day-to-day work that comes with creating a Final Fantasy, and the image in their minds of what this series is supposed to look like. As Clive gains the upper hand, Ultima starts to lose his composure. He can't even process how his will is being overtaken by what he deems a lesser creature.
Have you truly become free? No, I forbid it. You are not a god. You are but flesh and bone. You are not one of us. I created you, all of you. Mine is mine to destroy.
If Ultima is meant to convey the weight of expectations that come with this series, then Clive represents the developer, the everyday person just trying to make their way in the world. Throughout the entire runtime of the story, Clive has never felt worthy of the life he's been given. While his ideals are noble, it's felt like he's been carrying out someone else's mission, not really making the most of his life in the way he wants. Maybe that wasn't destined for Clive. Maybe he was always a part of this story regardless of whether he wanted to be or not. Against Ultima, Clive finally realizes what freedom truly is and meets Ultima at the level he craves so desperately. If he's meant to be the vessel, then he's going to do it his way.
For in us you saw yourself, and realized we had the potential to be more than you could ever be.
If the subtlety is lost on you, let me explain. Developers in gaming, from my understanding, are mandated to follow certain guidelines from those higher up. When it comes to Final Fantasy, I'd imagine these mandates to be quite restrictive. I can imagine being told what to do by people who don't really know what's going on can be quite frustrating. I tie this back to Yoshi P saying everything revolving around Clive. A lot of people went into the making of Clive, the writers who crafted his arc, the animators and designers that made this iconic look, down to the voice that brings him to life. His story is meant to be one about reflection, reflecting on how hard it is to make a game these days, and how hard it is to continue innovating in a franchise as old as this. That's why this fight is so special to me. It's a direct confrontation of those thoughts wrapped together in video game form. I believe the creators involved with 16 grew tired of what Final Fantasy was becoming, which is why they so obviously made the changes that they did. In that way, you could say it's very similar to Final Fantasy VII Remake, a game developed in spite of what the original creators wanted. The final scene in the Tale of the Mother Crystal brings all of this full circle. Ultima, the creator, asks a simple question: what will you do now that you've gained the freedom you so desired? Clive replies simply, but effectively: there is no need for a reason to live. For as his creations, all they can do is survive and hope the world that comes after this one is worth living in. The identity of this game was always predicated on freedom, having the freedom to choose your own fate, and having the freedom to choose what you create. If these developers aren't allowed to do the things that make them so legendary, how are we to expect a product that meets our rabid standards? Final Fantasy XVI is a story about power, what it means to have it, and the responsibility that comes with it. Its legacy will be remembered for trying to be different, for trying to truly innovate in a series that had slowly become more stale with each entry. And you know what? That's something I can rock with. I just wish everyone else was willing to see it that way. I know, I was all over the place. I hyper-focused on certain things that make this game truly spectacular, and kind of brushed past the stuff that didn't particularly impress me. This video wasn't designed to be a comprehensive dive into every little bit of detail. I literally did that already. I wanted to look at 16's place in the series now that the team's vision has been fully realized. And what I found was a title that truly belongs alongside all the other legendary games that came before it. It has the rich mechanics and gameplay that elevate the series to new heights. It has a world that's rich with interesting lore to discover, and it has the narrative that, yes, does stumble, but manages to tell a tale that's truly iconic in its own right. Even after all this, Final Fantasy XVI is still my favorite game of all time. Sure, it has flaws, but it's within these flaws where it's able to capture something no other game can. It means a lot to me, more than I care to admit, so to see where it's at 1 year later is very upsetting. Right before 16's release, SquareEnix held their 43rd annual shareholders meeting. This isn't a big deal on its own, but the results of this meeting changed this company, and not for the better, I'd argue. Takashi Kiryu was elected as the new president of SquareEnix. From what I've heard, the best word to describe him would be conservative. He is not much of a risk taker and will prioritize profitability over everything else. As a man of business myself, I can respect that, but as a fan of their games, I am very concerned. These games stand as some of the most expensive to develop in the entire industry, and with the returns they're getting, it seems like the HD division will suffer the most from this. This is something I constantly had in mind, and it brought me to this point here, where I think Final Fantasy XVI is probably the last time we'll ever see a game with this level of production, with this amount of love and care put into it. By its nature, it's a game that takes a lot of risks. Some of those panned out very well, such as the Eikon fights I hope remain series staples. Others didn't pan out so well, like presenting the narrative like an epic similar to Game of Thrones. I'd argue these two stories share more in common than people want to admit. None of that matters though. It's the poster child for Square Enix's failures. a flop commercially, not Final Fantasy. These are the things it is known for rather than the brilliance it manages to achieve. All those hype moments I talked about went overlooked to the general populace. When I think of all this, I'm very worried for the next entry in Final Fantasy. What could it do that could top this with a leader who's so risk-averse? Will Final Fantasy XVII even remotely resemble the energy the games before it had? Final Fantasy XVI won't be the last entry in the series. Not by a long shot. Shit, with the franchise so close to a 20th entry, they'll be pooping these out to get there alone. That said though, I believe this could be the end of the Final Fantasy we've known up till now. In essence, Final Fantasy XVI is the culmination of the series as a whole. It has everything the famous title stands for. It introduces new things to the long-running franchise. It is, in many ways, the Final Fantasy. One last attempt to show people that this formula that made these games stand out amongst the rest has value in today's industry. And while it did succeed in many aspects, the ones that mattered to those in power were not what it was able to achieve. With development costs on the continued rise, the hope for something to even match this level of quality is no longer guaranteed. Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 will arrive with all its fancy graphics and new mechanics, but after that, I honestly don't know, and that's what scares me the most. Maybe 16 didn't meet everyone's expectations, but what it did do was something I don't think we can just overlook. It dared to be different. It wanted to be its own thing. That's what makes video games so special. And if we remove that part from the creative process, then I question why we engage with this hobby at the level we do. Final Fantasy XVI is many things, but a failure is not one of them. I wish everyone else saw what I see in it. Maybe then the future would look a bit brighter. Because if we're not careful, we might lose what it was that made us fall in love with this series to begin with. I could never possibly predict the future, so I'll leave you with this. Whatever changes this series needs to undergo in the future, I can only hope this fantasy won't be the final one I witness.
Even now, you would deny the inevitable.
As we always have, and always will. On this, my sword, I swear, to shield the fireman's flame forevermore. I know the truth of it now. You are not afraid. I am.
The one possessed of the destructive flames of Ifrit, and the healing flames of the Phoenix. I see it now. Why you will never become Ultima's vessel.
Night undying!
That's my boy!
So absorbed was he in his own desires, so driven by his own will alone, that he shunned the one thing that could have made him truly powerful. Faith. The same faith people now place in you.
Gaze unrelenting!
Faith that you will fulfill their dream, Sid's dream of creating a better world for us. Faith that you will follow in Father's footsteps and save those who need saving most. Faith that you will answer Jill's plea to save yourself.
Ice unfeeling!
Together!
The difference is, Clive, you chose to listen. And that is what has steeled our bonds. Bonds that helped you stand firm when Ultima's pull was at its strongest. His power may be absolute, but so is ours. And so will yours be. With my light in your heart, not even a god might stop us. Forevermore.
So sure of your place atop the world, you refuse to acknowledge those below. So you shunned the one thing that could have made you stronger. Pushed away the hands that could have raised you higher.
I do not need you or anyone.
And that is where we are different. I could not have made it here on my own. I carry with me the hopes and dreams of my brothers, my sisters. And it is they who will give me the strength to end your reign.
Mortals! The world you see is but a fantasy!
The only fantasy here is yours. And we shall be its final witness.
Never!